Hello everybody, how are we tonight?
Very good.
We're very good. I love that information. Thank you. Thank you all so much for coming out this evening. My name is Ciara Ryan. I'm the Community Engagement Coordinator here at the Great Falls Public Library, and I love hosting events like this and all of the events that we do at the library, connecting people to knowledge here in Cascade County and throughout the entire state of Montana. Tonight I am super excited to be partnering once again with Cassiopeia Books in the back to sell books, but also to bring in authors from around Montana. It's really exciting to be able to do this kind of stuff. So tonight we have Ciara Ryan over here. Ciara is originally from Limerick, Ireland, and she fell in love with Montana as a Fulbright scholar in 2010 and has been researching Montana history and teaching the Irish, Spanish, and French languages ever since. She earned her PhD from the University of College Cork and has published numerous articles on the Irish language and history in Montana. Tonight's book is a little bit different. We have Henry Sieben and the Montana Story, and it dives into the extraordinary life of Henry, a German immigrant whose journey mirrors Montana's transformation from untamed frontier to a thriving state. I won't really go into any more details. I'm not the professional in this one. So that's why we brought in a professional. So join me in welcoming Ciara Ryan.
Hi everybody, thank you all so much. Can everybody hear me, I guess, first of all? Yes, well enough. Oh, I think actually the little bobble might have come off, but it sounds like it's doing okay? Yeah, it's doing okay. Thank you all very much for coming here tonight. I'm thrilled to be here, and thank you so much to Sarah here at Great Falls Public Library and to Millie at Cassiopeia Books for inviting me and the Foundation for Montana History to share with you tonight an excerpt, I think is kind of what I'm going to do, on the newly released biography on Henry Sieben and the Montana Story. And this biography shares the untold story of a ranching pioneer by the name of Henry Sieben. And have I any guesses on where you think he started his ranching career? I see you coming, but I don't know. Where do you think, Ben?
Culbertson.
Culbertson, right? So Culbertson, and actually just before Culbertson, he was actually here in Cascade County. He was actually in an area called the Chestnut Valley. Anybody familiar with the Chestnut Valley here in Cascade County? I had to dig quite a little bit, and I've spoken to a few of you who are here tonight about the Chestnut Valley. So I'm kind of going to speak to you about Henry's time here, ranching in Cascade County this evening. Henry Sieben himself, though, lived quite an adventurous life here in Montana. He arrived into Virginia City on John Bozeman's first and only complete trip over the Bozeman Trail in 1864. And he came in here a 17-year-old orphaned teenager, intent on making a better life for himself and his family. And then over the next 8 decades, yes, 8 decades, until his death in 1937, Henry transformed from a penniless teenager to a prosperous business and family man. And he was integral in helping create the building blocks of Montana society as we know today. And he also established a legacy that's still thriving in 2 ranches that some of you may have heard of that remain cornerstones of this state's agricultural heritage. And they are the Sieben and the A. Dell Ranch. And so for my talk today, I'm going to focus on sharing with you some of the highlights from Henry's early years in the Montana Territory, when he and his brother Leonard decided to delve into what was then the burgeoning cattle industry and establish a ranch in the Chestnut Valley here in Cascade County throughout the 1870s. So it's really a decade-long pursuit of his that really got him involved into the cattle industry in Montana. So a little bit on who Henry was and where he came from. His family had emigrated, as Sarah alluded to, from Germany to Illinois in 1852. And Henry was just 5 years old when he emigrated. And unfortunately for the Sieben family, their American dream was not to be. By the age of 12, Henry and his 6 siblings were orphans. However, in the spring of 1864, Henry's chance for a second shot at a better life arrived in the form of 2 of his good friends by the name of Louis Arnott and Louis Heller. They had secured a prairie schooner and 4 horses, and they had planned to travel west. And so faced with the options of military service, continued work as farm labourers in Illinois, or travel to the west, which do you think Henry chose? Travel to the west, and he headed to the gold fields. And so on April 18th, 1864, the 4 young friends embarked with a group headed west over the Mormon Trail. And at the time, they paid $90, which would kind of be around $1,700 today, a piece for their passage. And that included meals for the journey. They took turns driving and walking to ease the strain on their horses. And details are scarce about his overland trail experience, but he and his friends likely began their journey, and I'm going to bring up a little map here for you, by following the Mormon Trail from Nauvoo, Illinois, through modern-day Nebraska to the Platte River, and it's approximately 500 miles. And they had plenty of company on their journey, as nearly 40,000 migrants poured over it that summer. Half of them split off at the fork of the North and the South Platte Rivers to take the South Platte Road to Denver. The other half, including Henry and his group, they headed for the Montana and Idaho territories. So they turned north toward Fort Kearny and arrived at Fort Laramie in May of 1864. And here, Henry and his young friends, they had their first major decision to make. Officers at Fort Laramie had announced that single wagons would not be allowed to travel due to signs of unrest brewing with Native Americans. And so they required Henry and all travelers at Fort Laramie to form very large wagon trains as they headed west. So the question became for Henry and his friends, okay, which train do we take? There were groups already committed to the 800-mile-long Mormon Trail that went down south to Corrine, Utah, and then headed north to Montana, while others were considering one of the 2 newly established but more dangerous northern cutoff routes to the Montana Territory. And these, of course, became known as the Bozeman and Bridger Trails. John Bozeman was tall, good-looking, and wore a suit of fringed buckskin. And he made quite the impression on these young men. And so Henry, his brother Leonard, and their friends decided to follow Bozeman along his shorter but more perilous route. And the 500-mile journey over the Bozeman Trail was arduous and knuckle-biting, to say the least, at times. But on July 25th, 1864, 3 months and 7 days after they had left Illinois, Henry and his group arrived into the multicultural and sometimes quite chaotic town of Virginia City. And as vibrant and alluring as the town was, Henry and his party quickly discerned that they would not make their fortunes in Virginia City. Gambling and mining for a quick thrill held little interest to these young men. Instead, they decided to choose to gamble on themselves. And this was quite a thing. They were very young at the time. They were only teenagers. And so the group decided, okay, we're going to split up and go follow our own paths. And so Henry's 2 friends, Louis Heller and Arnett, they headed south down to Utah. His brother Leonard's keen eye quickly observed that just as important as extracting the precious metal from the streams and hillsides was the need for supplies for these mining camps too. And so shortly after their friends left, Leonard got a job with the Diamond Ore Company, freighting goods and supplies to Montana's mining towns. Henry soon joined his brother, and they spent the next 5 years until 1869 freighting supplies to Montana's mining camps. And by 1867, so just 2 years after they first started freighting, Henry and Leonard had established their own freighting business. And so I'm just bringing up a picture here for you of some ox teams pulling wagons on Front Street in Fort Benton around that time period. So this is kind of like the wagon that Henry would have had at the time too. So as the 1860s drew to a close, Henry and Leonard realized that they needed to focus their business actually elsewhere. The Transcontinental Railroad was nearing completion in 1868. And the Sieben brothers knew that when the train arrived in the Montana Territory, overland freighting would be largely unnecessary. So, just like he would do again and again over his career, Henry pivoted. And he and Leonard turned their attention to the cattle industry. Cattlemen, as many of you probably know, had entered the Montana Territory area before the gold rushes, arriving here as early as 1850. So by the time that Henry and his brother had arrived in Montana, the Grant brothers had several thousand head of cattle in the Deer Lodge Valley. The Poindexter-Knorr partnership was running one of the territory's largest cattle and sheep operations in the Beaverhead Valley. And other savvy businessmen, who many of you may have heard of, like Conrad Coors and Philip Lovell and Nelson Story, they had also turned to raising and selling livestock. So, in the spring of 1868, Henry and Leonard bought approximately 100 head of cattle in Fort Benton. And they bought them at the time for $10 to $12 per head. And then they looked after them for the year, and the following summer, they sold the cattle to a butcher in Fort Benton, and the sale netted them $90 to $100 per head. So that was easy math, right? So that settled it for the young men. They said, our next venture is going to be cattle raising. And then throughout the 1870s, the cattle industry developed rapidly. The fertile Sun River Valley, west of here, served as the main portal for the northeastward movement of the cattle industry at that time. Conrad Coors, for example, brought 1,000 head of cattle to the south bank of the Sun River near Fort Shaw in 1869. And from the beginning, water was a top priority for ranchers in Montana. And as the Sun River Valley filled up, others pushed beyond the Missouri into the sheltered confines of the Smith and Musselshell rivers. And they settled on creeks with various springs and water resources. And in the 1870s, most of the breeding stock were shorthorn, Hereford, and Angus cattle, and they grazed on open, unfenced range. And so the animals largely fended for themselves, with natural barriers such as forests and rivers limiting their movements. And so this allowed the ranchers to cut small amounts of hay, establishing a pattern of driving herds to the high country in the summer and back to the lush valley floors in the wintertime. And so the Sieben brothers, they got together and they studied these patterns, and they saw what their peers were doing. And they started to put a plan together. And in the spring of 1870, the brothers traveled to Kareem, Utah, where they purchased 160 cattle, mowing machines, rakes, wagons, and other equipment, and then they trailed them back to the Chestnut Valley, south of present-day Cascade. And by the following spring, they were ready to focus exclusively on raising and selling livestock. So they sold their freighting outfit to a man by the name of Thomas Clary, who was a wagon master with the Diamond Ore Freight Company, and they sold it for $3,700, so about $95,000 today. And they used the proceeds, and they were just young men at the time, a few years in the territory, and so they used these proceeds to then send Leonard and their ranch manager at the time, Henry Sieben, back to Utah to buy even more cattle. And so the pair bought, and then they trailed 400 head of cattle back to the Chestnut Valley, while Henry oversaw operations at the time. So by the fall of 1871, just 1 year later, the brothers' herd had grown to more than 600 cattle. And so the cattle industry in Montana, it was growing at the time, but it was also hugely competitive. And at the same time, the placer mining boom was waning, and many of the miners left, reducing the demand for beef. But Henry and Leonard persevered. They sold beef each spring to butchers in the still busy mining towns of Diamond City, Marysville, Helena, and Butte. They also sold cattle to purchasers who shipped the animals down the Missouri River from Fort Benton to Bismarck, and from there to Chicago by rail. And the daily work of the open range, it really suited Henry and Leonard. The brothers were strong, they were excellent horsemen, and they were accustomed to Montana's extreme weather. And in 1872, while they were ranching, Montana established a brand office and made brand registration a territory-wide requirement. And so now that they were becoming slowly but surely significant players in the cattle business, the Siebens needed to create and register their brand. And so in 1874, Leonard and Henry recorded their first ever brand, which was this, a diamond. And so when word started to reach their family back in Illinois of the brothers' success, their younger brother, by the name Jacob, or Jake as he was known to them, he decided he was also going to take a chance on Montana. And so after 8 years in the territory, Leonard and Henry finally received their first family visitor from Illinois. But unfortunately for Jake, his first winter in Montana, of course, was pretty cold. And Conrad Coors remembered the winter as one of the coldest he had ever experienced. Conrad Coors said, we were well clad, we wore moccasins and buffalo overshoes, had a blanket from our saddle that we wrapped around our legs and thighs. We experienced no trouble except with our mouth and our eyes. So everywhere that wasn't covered, really. The breath froze in our lips and we had trouble keeping our eyes open. All the quicksilver thermometers in Deer Lodge, they were frozen. And the way we found out how cold it was by Chris Weebo's thermometer at Silverbow, which registered 60 below. So that was Jake's first winter in Montana. So now 3 in number, the Sieben brothers built a substantial operation in the Chestnut Valley, Henry's first real home in Montana. And the Chestnut Valley was one of the earliest European settlements in Montana. It lies along the eastern side of the Missouri River, approximately 30 miles south of Great Falls, and it was described by Lewis and Clark in their journal of 1805 as a handsome level plain. It's located in what was a main overland route that connected Fort Shaw on the Sun River to the mining camp of Helena. And the first settler, and I had many conversations with people about this, but the first settler was the valley's namesake by the name of Robert Chestnut. No T in the middle, and I'm not great with T's, I'm Irish. Who built a cabin in the area in the fall of 1868. And the spelling without the first T is the correct one. So his name was Robert Chestnut, Chesnunt, but long usage has just made chestnut the more common form. Lush grass in the lowlands along the river and trees and brush for shelter made it an ideal place to winter oxen. And so more and more immigrants and families from Europe and from the East Coast settled in the Chestnut Valley in the 1870s. And they transformed the area into a stable community where the Sieben brothers could operate their cattle business. An original settler of the valley by the name of Eva Nolan, she recalled that there were numerous German settlers there, including the Siebens, Henry Burmeister, and Robert Abel. And the newcomers multiplied rapidly. Over the course of the 1870s, sheep ranchers increased in numbers and holdings throughout the territory, following the same path of geographic expansion into central Montana as the cattlemen. And so well-established investors began to take note of the potential of the sheep industry, especially when John Healy, a representative of a major wool purchasing concern, opened a depot in Helena in 1878. And Montana investors stocked the ranges by sending buyers to California and Oregon mostly. And drovers trailed sheep into the territory in bands of 2,000 to 6,000, sometimes those would stretch out 50 miles with the sheep. And by early 1879, 15,000 sheep were grazing on the Smith River and 60,000 were on the Musselshell River. So they were already learning to be at the forefront of emerging industries. They'd been in freighting, then they're now going into the cattle industry. And so the Sieben brothers saw this happening and they floated the idea of adding sheep to their operations too. And they decided this in 1875, so the sheep industry was still just beginning in Montana at the time. And it was Henry's younger brother Jake who proposed the bold business venture at a time when the brothers were navigating a national economic downturn, which had begun with the Panic of 1873. So large banks on the East Coast that were financing the railroads began to fold. And the collapse sparked high bank withdrawals, failed brokerage firms, and halted railway construction. And this downturn lasted until about 1879. And so while other outfits and cattle ranchers were tightening their purse strings, Leonard, Henry, and Jake, they bet on themselves. And that's the pattern you see with Henry Sieben over and over again, to just trust his instincts. And they expanded into the sheep industry. But in the mid-1870s, there were no sheep for sale in Montana. And so in fact, Henry would later recall that there were only 1 or 2 bands in the entire territory. But Jake was resolute that the future was strong for sheep. And so in 1875, Henry and Leonard agreed to finance him, and Jake traveled to Red Bluff, California to purchase over 2,000 merino ewes at an expense of $6,000. So that's about $170,000 today. A lot of sheep. And since construction on the Northern Pacific Railroad had halted in 1873, Jake had no choice but to trail the sheep back to Montana, a trip of 1,000 miles. And then Jake struggled in the first few years. He did not have that Midas touch that his older brother seemed to have. The weather was so bitterly cold in December 1875 when he came back with them that he was forced to stop in the Prickly Pear Valley near Helena. Leonard rode down to meet him when he found out that he was in trouble, and he found the sheep in such poor shape that he postponed a trip east in order to help care for them. Leonard hired a rancher to haul hay to the sheep, but they became so badly infected with mange that half the flock had died before springtime. And so in desperation, they called on help from I.G. Baker and Company in Fort Benton to bring them up 2 hogsheads, or large barrels, of scrap tobacco from St. Louis to dip the sheep and cure the mange. And when the tobacco arrived, Henry travelled north with 4 horse teams to pick it up, and then he hauled it back down to save his younger brother. And the 3 brothers built vats of 2-inch lumber and dipped the sheep twice in the summer of 1876. And the dip cured the animals, and Jake was able to save the remainder of the flock. But it was, of course, quite a hard lesson for the young man. And interestingly, the location of those dipping vats eventually became part of modern-day Sieben Ranch. They remain today by the Towhead buildings east of the Interstate 15 on the Sieben Flats. So they're still there today. Jake's poor luck with the sheep continued, and he suffered another heavy loss later that year. One particular winter morning, his herder turned a band of 1,200 sheep out of the corral and then returned to his cabin for breakfast. And while he ate, a storm drove the sheep across a half-frozen slough, and the ice gave way, and the sheep plunged into the freezing water, drowning 400. And so a Helena News article reported on it and offered the following advice to ranchers. And they said, never let the flock out of the corral until the herder is ready to go with them. And then see that the herder never leaves the sheep until they are back in the corral. So despite these setbacks, the Sieben brothers' operation continued to expand. Their reputations as businessmen also grew, and their activities were often reported in the local newspapers. So in March 1876, Henry and Leonard, along with one of their friends and neighbours, Charles Sweat, arrived in Helena with 60 head of beef cattle, and they sold them to a local grocer evening by the name of Guthrie and Norris. And the Helena Herald covered the business deal of this selling of 60 cattle. And they said the deal was made by the famous stockman who drove the cattle directly from the bunch grass ranges of Sun River in the Missouri, where they have run during the entire winter, receiving no other feed besides that supplied from the fields. And they were only in the territory 10 years then. And in the same edition, an overly excited, I think, journalist wrote that one of the Sieben's 7-year-old cows weighed 800 pounds, this made me laugh, weighed 800 pounds, this cow of theirs. And these shrewd businessmen could not have asked for better or possibly more exaggerated publicity for their ranching efforts. And so ranchers in the open range had to cooperate in segregating animals and determining ownership, resulting in the tradition of a roundup. And the roundup was a twice-annual cooperative effort to gather all the cattle in a region, sort them out, brand new calves, and trail each herd to its winter or its summer range. And the roundup was a regular feature of the Sieben brothers' year in the Chestnut Valley. And it usually lasted weeks and meant really hard work for everybody involved. And here's just a nice photo here of a cattle roundup. And here they're roping and killing a young beef for the mess between 1879 and 1930. And has anybody here heard of Teddy Blue Abbott, the cowboy poet? He wrote a wonderful memoir on We Pointed the North. And in that, he gave a wonderful description of a roundup. And I don't know what you all would think of. When I think of a roundup, I think of, yelling and noise and cattle and men and movement. And then Teddy Blue Abbott gave this beautiful anecdote about how at nighttime, what the roundups looked like. And he described that after everybody had settled down, they would gather the cattle in a circle and bed them for the evening, and then 2 of the ranchers would guard the cattle at night. And how they both would take opposite routes around the circle. And many of these ranchers were, like Henry, they came from Germany, some came from Sweden, Ireland, Scotland, and so they brought with them these folk tunes. And then they would sing a verse each of their folk tunes at night to calm the cattle and then also to keep themselves awake. Yeah. But it was just a lovely image. It was one of the, it's just a tranquil, quiet, fusion of landscape and art and people, but it was the peace and the contrast of that to what I envisioned when I think of a roundup. So I just thought I wanted to share that. It was just a nice little image of that time and what they would have been doing. The roundups required the Sieben brothers to be away from their ranches for significant periods of time throughout the year. And so while the Sieben brothers were away at roundups, Jake's wife Sylvia, so their little brother Jake had brought his wife and their 2 sons also to the Chestnut Valley. And while they were away on the roundups, his wife Sylvia and their 2 boys oversaw the running of the Chestnut Valley operation. And of course, women worked hard on the ranches. Sylvia washed clothing and household linens by hand and hung them out to dry in all types of weather. She served as doctor and pharmacist for the cowboys and sick neighbours. She cooked for family members and the hired help. She grew and preserved fruit and vegetables, raised chickens, milked cows, pigs, turkeys and geese for the family to eat and sell. But luckily for Jake, this type of life suited Sylvia. And despite the long hours of hard work, she found time to also enjoy the natural beauty of her new home. And so she also helped improve the Chestnut Valley community by providing much needed social outlets for the young and the old. So shortly after the snows and flood of her first few weeks in Montana, she turned her home into the local community hub in the Chestnut Valley, just as it was developing. And so she began to host regular socials for local families and the many bachelors that were in the Chestnut Valley. And she was also a musician, and she acquired an organ, which provided many nights of entertainment for dancing. I'm just going to share with you a photo here as well of one of the Chestnut Valley pioneers, Robert P. Thurman, and that is a picture of his home ranch in the Chestnut Valley in 1888. And so Sylvia was never idle, and she also organized the first school in the Chestnut Valley. And Anna E. Thurman, so Robert's wife, described Sylvia as, at all times, public-spirited and by nature an industrious, capable woman. She has been the greatest possible blessing to her less energetic neighbours in organising and carrying out schemes of entertainment for public good. So as Montana's population grew throughout the 70s, it required improved infrastructure, of course. And there was a government road from Fort Shaw on the Sun River to Fort Logan on the Missouri River, at the place where Cascade, Montana is located today, just north of the Chestnut community. But there was an increasing demand for a river crossing of some sort by the Chestnut Valley. And between 1875 and 1876, the US Army agreed to furnish a cable to the community if the Chestnut Valley residents would build and operate their own ferry. And so Henry and Leonard had grown up on a river in Illinois. And so they were quick to say yes to the arrangement because they had used a ferry on, and it was called Crandall's Ferry on the Rock River in Illinois. So they knew how to operate a ferry like this and how to build one. So Henry and Leonard took it upon themselves to lead the building of the boat, and they secured the cable from the army, and they operated the ferry for a short time. And I have a picture here of it. And that's the ferry boat at St. Clair. And soon they handed the operation over to really what seemed to me as I read about them, a real colourful trio of people. A man by the name of Nate Gibson, who lived in a dugout on the riverbank. Henry Zimmerman, who drowned when he fell off while crossing on a windy day. And Alvin Hodson, who was a neighbouring rancher. And as Henry knew it would, the ferry opened up new economic opportunities for the Chestnut Valley. A village known simply as the Ferry, and it was later known as Ulidia and then St. Clair, soon sprang up on the east bank of the Missouri River. The little community soon consisted of a ferry house, a saloon, a restaurant, a rooming house, Steele's Mercantile, and a cabin for the mercantile manager, Thomas Gorham. The ferry itself, the residents christened Mayflower, for the pilgrims who crossed the water to their new homes. And apparently, during low water, the remains of the boat can still be seen from the bridge that now stands in its place. So I'd love to hopefully see it someday, I haven't yet. But apparently you can still see it. And the ferry was a great benefit to locals and travellers alike. A grocery store was established, and Steele's Mercantile carried many necessary items, including finally women's dresses, men's work clothes, Stetson hats and boots. And Henry Sieben was famous, I don't know if any of you have heard any anecdotes about him, but he was famous for apparently never having worn cowboy boots. And when I read this, I said, oh, I wonder if this is where he got the idea for the Stetson hat and the suit that he was known for throughout his career. It may have started in the Chestnut Valley. So travellers' needs were well accommodated here at the ferry. And one early settler remembered that there was a keg of liquor next to the store too. And Mr. Gorham kept a lock on the keg's faucet, but would give the key to anybody who asked for it. But his clerks apparently were always not so generous. And so one day a thirsty traveller sidled up to the clerk and asked for the key. And the clerk handed him a wooden key, and it was about 2 feet long and handmade. And the stupefied man asked what it was, and the clerk replied, "This is the key to the river, go help yourself." And so as the Chestnut Valley community grew and prospered, so did Henry Sieben's livestock operation. He and Leonard continued their cattle partnership throughout the 1870s, gradually increasing their herd and selling the beef each year in the growing urban centres of Helena and Fort Benton. They were soon expanding their stock to include horses and continued to help Jake as he attempted to make sheep a profitable component of their operation. And so local newspapers continued to keep an interest in what Henry and Leonard were up to. And in early 1876, the Benton Record singled out Leonard in what was a really funny piece to read, honestly, titled "Bachelors of Sun River." And the community had recently held a leap year ball, and the writer wryly suggested that a few of my bald-headed friends were feeling neglected. Thus, the writer provided a witty report singling out the attire of a number of the bachelors at the ball. And how he described Leonard was black coat and vest, looking sheepish, but winked powerfully out of his left eye. Henry and Jake must have been particularly amused with this description of their older brother. And that spring, a writer at the Rocky Mountain Husbandman visited the valley, and he wrote an insightful report on the activities and the people in the area. He described the expanse of the land, 3 miles wide at the Sieben location, as well as the high-quality hay at their disposal. He referred to Leonard and Henry as the largest stock owners in the valley at the time, and noted their preparation to build a large 2-story dwelling to house their younger brother Jake and his family. And he described the valley's residents as friendly, hospitable, and touched on the fact that the bachelors in the community encouraged immigration, particularly women. By 1878, both Leonard and Henry were looking further afield, though, to develop business opportunities as well as to settle down and find love. So Leonard, Henry's older brother, left for Spring Hill, Illinois in January of 1878. And there he found a wife by the name of Sarah J. Hines, a native of the state. And Leonard brought Sarah back to Montana in late May of that year. And so now Henry was the only bachelor amongst the Sieben brothers. So that fall, I think he attempted to follow in Leonard's footsteps, and he made his first journey home since he had arrived in Montana in 1864. So 14 years later, he made his first journey back to Geneseo in Illinois, since he had left 14 years prior. And he spent the entirety of that winter out east. And I think his intention may have been to find a bride, but I think it says a lot about Henry that it ended up instead just being quite a business trip. And he made sure to keep abreast of economic and social developments in Helena while he was away. In January, he wrote to Ike Greenhood of Greenhood and Baum Company, merchants in Helena, requesting a 3-month subscription of the Helena Herald. And this is the earliest surviving letter that we have belonging to Henry. And it was quite a find when I was delighted when I finally found a letter from Henry at the Montana Historical Society, because there was no correspondence belonging to him surviving from any of his family members. There were pocketbooks, there were business ledgers, but not one shred of correspondence. And so this was the early, I ended up finding 4 letters, and this was the earliest one that I could find on him. And here I'm gonna have to find my writing here. As expected for an immigrant with little formal education, this was interesting, to read his actual handwriting as well at the time. There are misspellings, and there are traces, of course, of Henry's mother tongue, German. So might, M-I-G-H-T, is spelled M-I-T-E, and have is spelled H-A-F, and bean is spelled B-E-N. And water has 2 T's whenever he was writing too. So back in the Chestnut Valley, it was business as usual for Leonard, but it was not the case for his wife, Sarah. So unlike Jake's wife, Sylvia, who I told you about that became a kind of at the heart of the Chestnut Valley community, Leonard's wife Sarah just couldn't settle into ranch life. Leonard decided just after a year that he would have to return back to Illinois with his wife, and that his time in the West had come to an end. And so he and Sarah decided to return to Illinois to raise their family in an urban setting with all the amenities that such a location brings. But so that was the first time in their lives Leonard and Henry's paths were about to diverge. And it was quite a formative moment for Henry. He had just turned 33, and up until this point, Leonard, his older brother, had been by his side at every life-changing juncture. And together they had survived the journey west, they had traveled the territory's dirt roads for miles and miles, and they understood Montana's territory, the Montana territory. They observed and learned about market trends, and they had bet and learned on themselves in the stock business, and had reached the decade's end as established stockmen here in Cascade County. But the winds of change were propelling them on their own destinies. And so Henry would now be solely responsible for the cattle operation, and would no longer have his confidant to navigate the challenges ahead. But instead of following his brother back to Illinois, he had fallen under Montana's spell by this point. And after some reflection, Henry decided to stay, and he bought out Leonard's interest in their cattle business. Before Leonard's departure, their younger brother Jake, he also decided to stay in Montana. He sold his flock to a recently arrived businessman, who you may have heard of by the name of Paris Gibson, for $3.10, or approximately $100 today, a head. And then he purchased over 5,500 sheep from Red Bluff, California. And this move made Jake one of the largest sheep growers in the territory at the time. And on a sub-freezing day in December 1881, the Utah Northern Union Pacific Railroad was finally about to reach the copper-rich town of Butte. And this, of course, was the single most transformational economic development in the entire history of Montana. Equipment, capital, and people would begin to pour into the formerly primitive community. And the next decade would bring new and bigger challenges and opportunities for Henry. As local and national promotion of the Chestnut Valley took off and started to increase in the 1880s, so too did the number of stockmen on the range. And before this really started to take hold, Henry, again, another pattern that you see with him as you look into what he did and where he moved and why, he started to foresee these issues of overstocking on the range. And he began, just as Leonard decided to move back east towards Illinois, Henry began to look further afield at new pastures for his own stocks to graze on. He observed that ranchers were pushing eastward down the Musselshell Valley in search of new range. And one such rancher was his neighbour, Robert or Bob Coburn, who had a ranch in the Chestnut Valley. And he had recently settled on an area called Flat Willow Creek. And Henry's old associate from Virginia City, Granville Stewart, had recently partnered with businessmen Samuel Hauser and Andrew Davis to establish the famous DHS Ranch on the southeast flank of the Judith Mountains near Fort Maginnis. And so Granville Stewart had combed central and eastern Montana by horseback in 1880 and had found almost empty countryside. Stock were largely grazed on ranges of southwestern and west central Montana at that point. In the far northern and eastern and southeastern expanses of the territory, Native American lands were being consistently reduced, thus opening up vast new areas for stockmen from outside the territory to situate their herds. So Henry decided to spend the 1880s ranching alongside James Fergus and Granville Stewart in central Montana. And this was a hand-drawn map that I came across in the Historical Society too, by Granville Stewart. And he drew this map in 1882, and it depicts where he was drawing it to show the DHS range near Fort Maginnis. But on there too, he notes exactly where Sieben had his ranch in Flat Willow. So that was amazing to come across. Henry helped organize ranchers in the Montana Stock Growers Association, protected their interests by founding the North Montana Roundup Association. He navigated the hard winter of 1886 to 87. Some of you may have heard of that event too. He married Alberta Gordon, had 2 daughters, And so this is his wife, Alberta Gordon. And then these are his two daughters, so Bernice is on the left and Margaret in the middle, and then that's a picture of Henry later on with his granddaughter, Jean Baucus. And they built a permanent home in Helena and established one of the largest ranchers that Beth mentioned earlier too in Culbertson, called the Diamond Ranch. He also invested in real estate here in Cascade and also here in Great Falls. He diversified revenue streams by investing in mining ventures. He weathered droughts, fires, and depressions. And in 1898, he once again invested in sheep. So he left sheep when his brother Leonard returned back to Illinois. He just let Jake have the sheep. I think Henry just had enough after those experiences of bailing his younger brother out. And he said, I like cattle. And he stuck with cattle for most of his career, until then in 1898. And there was a lovely quote in an oral history from a business associate that had known Henry Sieben. And he was being asked about why did Henry get back into the sheep business. And he said that, you know, Henry was never a sheep man. But towards the 1890s, sheep were business. And Henry was a businessman. So I thought that was interesting. And it was Henry's younger brother Jake's death in 1904 that encouraged Henry to refocus his business operations here again in Cascade County. So he left Cascade County in 1880. He ventured over to Flat Willow, which is kind of by present day Winnett. Then he went further east to Culbertson. And then he decided towards the end of the 1890s that he wanted to invest in sheep back in Cascade County again. And it was his brother's death that encouraged him to do that. Jake's death greatly shocked Henry and his brother Leonard. And Leonard, who had moved back to Illinois in 1879, travelled back in 1904 when his brother Jake passed away, to be with Henry. He wanted to see Henry and experience once again the land that the three brothers had made home 30 years previous. So Henry brought Leonard and his family out to Cascade and to the Chestnut Valley, where they visited with some old friends. And Leonard's daughter Ruth recalled that they visited the cabin where their mother Sarah, when she'd only lasted that year, lived, before returning to Illinois with Leonard. And as the brothers reminisced about their early years and adventures in the Chestnut Valley, Leonard and Henry recalled that their cattle would always drift away back into the mountains behind the valley, and the brothers would have to saddle up their horses and look for them. And the funny thing was that they always found their cattle in the same place, close to where Middle Creek Dam now stands. And Henry called it the hole in the wall, and remembered he'd once declared that if he ever got enough money to purchase a ranch of his own, and if that property was available, he would purchase a ranch right there. And so after spending time reflecting on their youthful days in the valley, the Siebens visited Jake's widow Sylvia and her son Charles on their ranch in Cascade. And Ruth laughingly remembered that to Henry's absolute horror, Charles, his nephew, brought the two Sieben families on a carriage ride through Great Falls red light district. And the family reunion brought some much needed closure to the brothers' grief, while also instilling in Henry a renewed interest in the land east of Chestnut Valley. And so just a couple of years later, in 1907, after that nostalgic trip, Henry jumped on an opportunity to purchase the Cannon Brothers Ranch at Adel, located northeast of Cascade. So that's an interesting, he'd been in Montana over 40 years before he purchased that Adel Ranch. And he did it in 1907. So for the first time, though, he purchased that ranch solely in his own name, without family members or business associates joining him in the venture. He finally owned the whole of the wall. And that ranch, as well as the Sieben Ranch just north of Helena, is still owned and operated by Henry's descendants today, 160 years later. And so if you'd like to find out more about Henry's adventures, about his colourful life, please, would love you to get a copy of Henry Sieben and the Montana Story. And the amazing thing about this work is that all the proceeds go back into the Foundation for Montana History and their grant program that supports history throughout the state, where Henry's footprint is, I think. But thank you. Thank you all very much for coming. Just a little excerpt for you about his time in the Chestnut Valley, but lots to read about the other 7 decades that he spent in the state in the book. So thank you all very much for coming, and thank you, Ciara.
All right, well, thank you all so much for being here with us. It's always always nice to have a history lesson on a nice Thursday evening. Please purchase the book. Be a part of the history that is written down now. We always have things going on here at the Great Falls Public Library. Just a solid reminder that next week, Friday and Saturday evenings, is Shakespeare in the Parks. So we have both shows coming to Great Falls. Friday night is Henry V, and Saturday night is As You Like It. Great Falls Theater Company is a co-sponsor, as well as the Great Falls Public Library Foundation. But the Great Falls Theater Company is also doing the pre-show at 5 p.m. So bring your picnic baskets, bring your chairs and your blankets, and come spend an evening with us under the big sky over in Gibson Park. Can't wait to see you there, along with all the other things that we have happening at the library. Thank you again for coming out, and thank you, Ciara.
Anybody have any questions as well?
Yeah, and now is the time for questions, for sure.
Thank you so much, Sarah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Any questions?
Now's the time. Yes.
I'll ask a question. I'll
Thank
break
you.
the ice. So, did you find any information about why they chose to get the sheep from that part of California? Was there any commentary on that?
There wasn't really, it was just that that's where there were
Right.
large, I think, sheep ranchers at the time, was in Oregon and California. And Red Bluffs, I presume they just had contacts that he knew where to go.
Yeah, they had huge flocks of sheep also in New Mexico.
Yeah.
And at one point I had read that the first sheep in Montana had been driven up from New Mexico, but I can't remember where I read that. But I was just curious
Yeah.
that they had gone to California. It makes sense though.
Yep. And it was very specific, and it was Henry in an interview later recalling, and we sent him to Red Bluffs, California,
Oh,
to
yeah.
get that band of sheep. Yeah.
Did any of the Siebens take advantage of the Homestead Act? Did they use that?
That's a great question. Yes. So after the hard winter of 1886-87 is when, 1890s towards 1900s was the Homestead Acts. There's several of them. And absolutely, Henry, as well as I think every big rancher at the time, very much took advantage of the Homestead Act.
They filed their claims.
They filed their claims and expanded bit by bit, absolutely. And then bought up as well at different points in time the other homesteads that were around them. Like oftentimes when there was economic depressions or there were downturns, or anything like that, and people wanted quickly to sell and get out, that was when the people who had established a little, financial reserves, they were able to then buy little pockets bit by bit. Yeah.
My favorite homestead story is it'd be 21 to file a claim. And so the young teenage men would write 2-1 inside their heel. So when they said, "Are you over 21?" they'd say yes.
I've never heard of that.
Oh yeah, because they were good, straightforward church going.
That's a great story. Any other questions? Yes.
So, I heard the term Chestnut Valley.
Yes.
What river, was it surrounding the Missouri River?
Yes,
Or was it
exactly.
Chestnut Valley?
Yep,
And
yep,
it goes
east
from
of the
where to
Missouri
where?
Valley. So the Chestnut Valley, it's an area more than anything else. And there's no, and correct me if I'm wrong, because I keep hearing differing things on this, but there are no surviving structures from that era. But it's an area east of the Missouri River back towards the mountains. So it's 30 miles south of here and just south of Cascade.
Okay.
So and it's still today when you drive, if you're going south to Helena and on your left and you're looking over east of, you pass Cascade and then you look east, there is a community on the eastern side of the Missouri River, and there are houses dotted along there going back towards the mountains, and I think that's exactly where the Chestnut Valley was.
Okay.
It was right there.
You might have covered this before we came, sorry to be late. The Hibbard, I take it they're sisters.
Yes.
Okay.
Exactly.
Then how are they related to Henry Sieben?
So one of the daughters is Edward. So he had two daughters. And Bernice is on the left and she married a man by the name of Fred Sheriff. And then they had a daughter, Jean, who married a Baucus. And then that's where that line went. And they currently run the Sieben Ranch.
Right.
And then they had a daughter, Margaret, who's here in the middle, Margaret, and she married a man by the name of Alfred T. Hibbard. And then that's the Hibbard family. So there's the Baucus and Hibbard families today. Yep. And he very purposefully, you know, he had the two daughters, and the way he ended his life was that he had two ranches. And they were both close to Helena, where he raised them both. And he had come from, and you know, he was an orphan by the age of 12, had nothing, like his family life was really, really a struggle all his life until he came to Montana. And he really stood out to me as I kind of learned about him more and more, that kind of what separated him from the many, many thousands of others who tried to also, you know, ranch and kind of find financial security was Henry just had this incredible clarity of vision. And he just, even from the age of 17, when I recall that he came into Virginia City, he saw the gambling, he saw the mining, he could make a quick buck. But his goal from the get-go was to establish financial security that he never had, and to fulfill that American dream that his parents had brought him from Germany for, but that they couldn't do. And so he wanted it not just for him, he wanted it for his children and generations, you know, because his parents had tried to do it for him. And he just did everything. He used all of his energies in just solidly in pursuit of that goal. And he was a very different character to a lot of the more well-known ranchers of the time, like Granville Stewart, James Fergus, Nelson Story, who were gregarious characters, you know, colourful and outspoken. And Henry was much more just quiet, reserved, like did all the work behind the scenes, but did not want to be on the forefront. He was just had a mission, which was just to work hard behind the scenes. So that was, yeah, thank you. Yes.
Carol, one of the quotes that you have in the book, I might not have it correct, but I thought it was really a good one from someone, not from Henry Sieben.
And that's just what you see with him. He was just had an innate acumen for business from the get-go. He just understood, you know, that's how he was wired. He understood and he thought long-term, and he never, descriptions of business associates was that he never did anything quickly. You know, he would stand back and reflect and take his time and do things quietly, but he loved to play poker in the Montana Club in Helena. And then, all of his associates would say, oh my gosh, when he had a good hand. And then it applied, I think, to most areas of his life, you know. But he struggled quite a bit too. You know, it wasn't as a sunshine road for him once he got here, not at all. And he lost 75% of his herd in the hard winter of 1886-87 and basically had to rebuild from nothing again after 20 years here. So he got through quite a bit as well.
I also love the fact that he was very kind to his livestock, to his horses. He did not put up with any abuse of animals.
I agree.
Just a very, very kind man.
That was an interesting layer to him, actually, I have to say. You know, when I started to kind of peel back the layers of his personality, seeing that empathy for animals, for orphans. He was one of the founders of the Montana Home Society in Helena. Very charitable, very kind to children, mentored everybody coming up behind him. And I think it comes from just his own background, you know, and he did never become hard and cold at all. And his daughters, yes, spoke about all the time about how kind and gentle he was. And even when he would ride, you know, with his horses and was, you know, herding cattle, he would never yell or roar. He was quiet all the time and just say, take things quietly, take things quietly. He spoke quietly in his business hat and suit while he rode. So he was different, you know, he was a little bit different from his contemporaries at the time.
And the daughters got quite involved in the ranches.
They did, yeah, he mentored them to be able to run the ranches when he had exactly that, yeah. And the foremen too, and the crews. He apparently had a great gift of selecting the right crews and spent time with them, and wasn't just sitting in Helena, you know, and letting the ranches run themselves. He had been out in the range most of his life, and then the Sieben and Adele ranches, he was out there with them as much as he could be too. And mentored the two daughters who then took on the ranches when he passed, and they brought them on to the next generation, you know, and it's continued down generation to generation because of them. Yeah. That is a good quote, though. I like that too.
So in 1886, 87, that terrible winter, he was on
Flat Willow Creek.
Flat Willow
He
Creek.
was.
And did he have primarily cattle or did he have sheep then?
Just cattle.
Okay.
Just cattle at that time.
I'm
Yeah.
wondering,
Yeah.
but he didn't have sheep. I was wondering if the sheep were as devastated by that winter as the cattle.
That's a great question, and they weren't. They weathered it much better than cattle. And
They did.
They did.
Uh,
And so I think that, along with seeing the increase in the sheep industry, the development of the industry itself, like by 10 years later, Montana was the #1 wool producing state in the nation. And I think him having weathered the hard winter with his cattle and losing so many of them, and the sheep doing better, I think that was actually critical in him going back and finally saying, okay, I'm going to invest in sheep.
The thing that amazes me about Montana ranchers, especially the ones I know best around the Highwood Mountains and central Montana, is how they would range from sheep in one period to cattle in another and then back to sheep.
Exactly.
It's pretty amazing to me that we didn't have Johnson County, Wyoming.
I was just thinking the same thing.
Or because our ranchers were handling both cattle and sheep.
Exactly.
Did Henry ever give any indication of which area he liked best to ranch? I mean, he's one rancher that moved all over the place.
That's a great question. He never said specifically where he liked best, but just through his actions, I think he started in the Chestnut Valley, went further east, but then brought it brought it full circle and came back. And I think he had a few quotes like describing that ability to buy the hole in the wall that he had seen when he first came into Montana. That I think made him very, very happy. And I suppose for him, probably at that point in his life, was quite nostalgic too, because that's where he and his younger brother and Leonard had started out. So I think that was one of his favorites. If I was to guess, he never said outright. I think that was like where the two ranches are today was his favorite area. But I can imagine the 1880s were extremely exciting for him too, with Granville Stewart and James Ferguson. He was the young rancher at the time, and learning from them, in central Montana, I'm sure was pretty interesting.
We need to talk another time about Bob Chestnut. He was quite a character. He was a very good friend of the Thurmans. In fact,
Okay.
Bob
Yeah.
Chestnut was a Confederate. He'd been in the 6th Texas Cavalry. And in the Chestnut Valley, of course, one of his neighbors was Yank. I've forgotten Yank's last name. You all know the story. But here's Confederate Bob Chestnut and Yank, whatever his last name was, that were loggerheads all the time. And Yank was found murdered or suicide. It was never clear which. And of course, a lot of people suspected Bob Chestnut, but Bob Chestnut just wasn't the right, it didn't make sense. But anyway, he had very few friends, but the Thurmans were his closest friends. And Dick Thurman of Sun River Valley historical fame showed me some of the things he had that Bob Chestnut had given. For instance, one Christmas in 1880, Bob Chestnut was invited to the Thurman home, and he brought an autograph book for the young Thurman, and he wrote in it, Captain Robert Chestnut, 6th Texas Cavalry, Confederate States of America, and presented it to the son of R.P. Thurman. And it was that close family relationship, or close family friendship between the Thurmans and Chestnut. And Chestnut was death on anyone who put a T on his name. Because he said, I'm no damn nut. So there's all kinds of great stories about Bob Chestnut in Chestnut Valley.
Is that your next book?
Possibly, right? Talk to Ken.
Bob Chestnut actually.
I feel like Ken already has the story.
His Civil War service is in my one of my Civil War books. Good job, thanks.
Thank you. Well, thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it.
That was very nice.
Oh, thank you.
Yes.
Thank you very much.